You will probably face two problems when glazing. On one hand, it can take far too many coats and feel like a lot of effort. On the other, every time you lift up your brush, a little blob of paint is left behind. We will talk about dilution and the number of coats once we move on to the red armor. But first, I want to take a closer look to that little blob of paint. Not just how to prevent it, but also how to make it work in our favor. To demonstrate, I'll be painting this power sword starting with two thin coats of turquoise. However, I will intentionally leave a small gap where only a single coat is present, and I will also add a bit of stippling next to it. Being color number 1 the base coat and color number 2 the new color we want to introduce, when glazing with color number 2, we want to move away from color number 1 and finish each brushstroke over color number 2. That way, most of the pigments are deposited over the same color, while only a thin transparent filter is left behind over color number 1. But by letting those extra pigments build up over the stippled area, we can create a smooth transition much faster than if we had a perfectly clean line between the two colors and tried to blend everything from scratch. The stippling already gives us a rough transition, so instead of fighting that little blob of paint, we can use it to improve the blend. Now of course, if we remove most of the excess diluted paint on a paper towel, we can reduce that pigment buildup almost entirely. But by combining stippling with glazing, I have found that I can achieve clean transitions in just 2 or 3 coats. But don't think glazing always have to move forward. Here I went back to the turquoise and glazed in the opposite direction to improve the transition, once again using the stippled area as a safe place to deposit the pigments. When I move on to the final color, things changed a little. White is notoriously difficult to glaze because it often leaves behind a grainy finish, so instead I went back to the basic principle of depositing the extra pigment over the same color, while starting the glaze on the stippled area. In this case, I started the white glaze on the stippling and finished my brushstroke towards the tip of the sword. To improve the transition even further, I then went back to blue-green and glazed in the opposite sense, starting over the blue-green and depositing the pigments over the stippled white area, avoiding having to struggle against white's poor glazing properties. The lesson here is to avoid thinking of glazing as a process that only moves forward. It is perfectly natural to step back to a previous color, especially if you are still learning the technique. That isn't a mistake. In fact, it often helps create an even smoother blend. Just remember that if you are painting gaming miniatures, transitions will always look better from tabletop distance than they do under a camera or when viewed from up close. Now, when it comes to dilution and the number of coats, let's move on to the red armor. Red is a color that normally takes quite a few coats to reach full saturation, unless you paint it over a light undercoat. Here I have pushed my highlights all the way to a pinkish tone, and I will use a single red glaze to tie everything together. So, how much should you dilute your glazes? Some people recommend 3 or even 4 parts water to 1 part paint. The truth is, like many things in the hobby, it depends. For example, here I have 2 different reds, both diluted 1:1 with water. As you can see over a white surface, the one on the left produces a much stronger tint than the one on the right, because it's far more heavily pigmented even though they come from the same brand. This is something you will only really learn through experience and by testing your paints. As a general starting point though, I usually begin around 2 parts water to 1 part paint. That gives me a noticeable change after just 1 or 2 coats, while still leaving enough pigment behind to make the glaze worthwhile. Back to the model, I'll apply the red glaze over the entire surface, working one section at a time. The important part is making sure every brushstroke finishes over the pink highlights, since that is the part where we want most of the pigments to deposit. Once dry, just a single coat of that 1:1 mix creates a night and day difference. Not only are the pink highlights pulled much closer to a rich red, but the dark areas also become slightly more vibrant. Glazing over darker colors won't be nearly as effective as glazing over lighter ones. However, it still creates a subtle shift that helps pull all the layers closer together. It is something I use quite often on monochromatic surfaces whenever I want to transform a rough sketch into a smooth finish using nothing but a brush. Just be careful not to lose your shadows in the process, and if necessary, just like we discussed earlier, you can always go back with a darker glaze and work in the opposite direction. In the end, just 2 coats of glazing completely transform this rough, sketchy armor into something much smoother while making the colors noticeably richer. I hope you found this video helpful and that glazing feels a little less intimidating now. If you still have any questions, or if there is something you'd like to see me cover in more detail, let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.